My name is Hailey Preston, and I was 24 years old when I stood in the rain at my father's funeral in Lake Oswego, Oregon, and watched my stepmother accept condolences like a woman accepting compliments on her dress. The rain that day was the cold, persistent kind that the Pacific Northwest specializes in, a steady grey downpour that soaked through the black umbrellas clustered around the grave and turned the cemetery lawn to mud at the edges of the gathered crowd. I stood near the back, my coat soaked through at the shoulders, watching the casket lower into the ground and trying to hold myself together in a way that felt increasingly impossible. My father, Raymond Preston, had been the only steady thing in my life since my mother died when I was 9. Watching him disappear into the earth felt like watching the last wall of a house come down. Across the open grave, shielded by a hired assistant holding an umbrella large enough for 3 people, stood Margaret, my father's second wife. She wore black, expensively tailored, the kind of mourning outfit that had clearly been selected with the same care she brought to galas and benefit dinners. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief at intervals that struck me, even through my own grief, as slightly too rhythmic to be involuntary. Beside her stood Connor, her son from a previous marriage, my stepbrother in name only, looking at his phone with the particular boredom of someone counting down the minutes until he could leave. I had not been allowed to see my father in the last 6 months of his life. That fact sat in my chest like a stone, the entire funeral, heavier than the grief itself, because the grief at least made sense. My father had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia 3 years before his death, and in the time since, Margaret had systematically rebuilt the architecture of his life around her own control of it. She fired the nurses he liked and replaced them with ones who answered to her. She had his phone number changed twice, each time citing some new security concern that never quite held up to scrutiny. She told me, the last time I was permitted into the house, that visits upset him, that his doctors had recommended limiting outside stimulation, and that she would call when he was more stable. The call never came. I hired a lawyer 18 months ago to try to force visitation rights through Adult Protective Services. The case moved at the glacial pace these things move at, and by the time anything resembling progress had been made, my father was gone. I had $300 in my checking account at the time of the funeral and a part-time job doing freelance bookkeeping for 2 small businesses in Portland, and none of that would have mattered to me in the slightest if it meant I could have spent even one more afternoon with my father. I would have given everything I owned for that. As it turned out, I was about to be asked to give up considerably less and finding myself, in the moment, almost relieved by how little I had left to lose. My father had married Margaret 9 years earlier, 3 years after my mother died of a sudden aneurysm that took her from us in the space of a single afternoon. I was 15 at the time, and I remember with the particular clarity that grief gives certain memories, the first time Margaret walked through our house, assessing it the way a buyer assesses a property rather than the way a person settles into a home. She was a divorcee from a wealthy Seattle family, polished and socially fluent, in a way. My mother, a former elementary school teacher, who had built half the family's auto parts business alongside my father with her own hands, had never bothered to be. The 2 women could not have been less alike. And for years I told myself that my father's choice was simply about loneliness, about wanting someone beside him in a life that had become too quiet. It took me longer than it should have to recognize that Margaret had never married my father out of loneliness solving. She had married into a $14 million business with the patience of someone who understood that the largest returns come to people willing to wait for them. The reading of the will took place 2 days later in the downtown Portland office of Thomas Whitfield, my father's longtime estate attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man, who had known my family for over 20 years, and who looked, when I walked into his office, like a man bracing for something he already knew was coming. Margaret arrived 12 minutes late, trailing the scent of expensive perfume and irritation. Connor slouched behind her in a blazer that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have never had to think about money. She sat across from me at the conference table, checked a diamond watch I didn't recognize, and told Whitfield, without preamble, that she had a property closing at 2 and would appreciate efficiency. Whitfield opened the binder. He read in the flat, careful cadence of a man who has delivered difficult news many times and has never found a way to make it easier, only more orderly. The estate was valued, as of the most recent appraisal, at just over $14 million. The lakefront mansion went to Margaret. The auto parts business my father had spent 30 years building into one of the largest regional chains in the Pacific Northwest. 22 stores across 3 states went to Margaret, with Connor named as incoming CEO despite having no operational experience in the company beyond a brief and unsuccessful stint in the marketing department 4 years earlier. The investment portfolio, the classic car collection, the vacation property on the coast, all of it, every asset of consequence, transferred to Margaret in a document my father had signed 4 months before his death, at a point in his illness that I knew, with absolute certainty, had been advanced enough that he could not have reliably told you what season it was. And, to my daughter, Hailey Preston. Whitfield read, and I watched his jaw tighten slightly before he continued. I leave the property known as the Miller Tract, including the existing structure, free and clear of any encumbrances. I sat very still. That's it? The Miller Tract, Whitfield said, consists of 2 acres on County Road 14, with a single barn structure currently under county condemnation order. I knew the place. Everyone in the family knew the place, in the vague way you know about a relative's old property that nobody discusses directly. It sat at the end of a long dirt road outside the city. 2 acres of blackberry brambles and second-growth forest, with a collapsing barn at its center that had been condemned by the county for structural failure years earlier. It had no electricity, no plumbing, no road access beyond the rutted dirt track that led to it. It had, as far as anyone in the family had ever indicated, no value of any kind beyond the sentimental, and even that had faded with disuse. Margaret made a small sound that I understood, after a beat, was a laugh she wasn't bothering to fully suppress. Well, she said, your father always said you liked getting your hands dirty. I suppose he thought it suited you. He had dementia, I said, my voice rising before I could stop it. He couldn't have understood what he was signing 4 months before he died. You know that. Everyone in this room knows that. Margaret's expression shifted, the warmth she performed for company evaporating into something colder and more direct. 3 independent physicians certified his competency on the day that document was executed. She said, I have the paperwork. I have excellent attorneys. If you would like to contest this will, Hailey, I promise you it will cost more than you have and take longer than you can survive without an income. She reached into her bag and produced a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table with 2 fingers, the way you'd slide something distasteful away from yourself. Sign this waiver, and I won't pursue you for the property tax arrears on that barn, which I was planning to demolish for a storage facility regardless. Consider it generosity. I looked at the waiver. I looked at Whitfield, who would not quite meet my eyes, which told me everything about how confident he was in my chances of fighting this successfully. I thought about my bank account. I thought about the 18 months and the money I had already spent trying to get adult protective services to take my concerns about Margaret seriously. Money I did not have to spend and had spent anyway because I loved my father and there had been no other way to reach him. I thought, finally, about the barn itself, the handful of memories I had of being small and sitting on a hay bale, while my father, younger then, grease on his hands, fixed an old engine and told me stories about his grandfather. It was the only thing on the table that Margaret hadn't already poisoned with her presence. Everything else in this estate had 3 years of her fingerprints on it. The barn was the one place she had never bothered to go. I signed the waiver. Smart girl, Margaret said, tucking the paper back into her bag with the satisfaction of a woman closing a transaction that had gone exactly as planned. Enjoy the mud. The eviction notice on my apartment came 2 weeks later. My father had been quietly covering the gap between my freelance income and my rent for over a year, a fact I hadn't fully appreciated until the support simply stopped. And without it, I was $300 short on a payment due in 9 days, with no plausible way to close the gap in time. I packed what I owned into the back of my 10-year-old Subaru and drove out to the Miller Tract on a gray Tuesday afternoon with a tent, a sleeping bag, and a propane heater, because it was the only piece of ground in the world that legally belonged to me and I had nowhere else left to go. The barn looked worse in person than it did in memory. The blackberry brambles had grown into a thorny wall around the structure, dense enough that I spent the better part of 3 hours hacking a path to the doors with a machete I'd bought for exactly this purpose. The barn itself leaned visibly to one side, the wood grey and split from decades of weather, sections of the corrugated roof missing entirely and leaving the interior exposed to the elements in patches. When I finally got the heavy sliding doors open, they screamed against rusted tracks and released a cloud of dust that smelled of old hay, mildew, and something underneath that I couldn't immediately place. Inside, the space was a graveyard of generational clutter. Rusted barrels, collapsed wooden pallets, the hulking skeletal remains of an antique tractor parked dead center on the dirt floor, like a monument to a use the building no longer served. I set up a dry corner as a camp and spent the next several days clearing debris, assessing what reclaimed wood might be salvageable for sale to the furniture makers and architectural salvage shops in Portland, doing the math on how many weeks of this work it would take to scrape together a security deposit somewhere new. It was grinding, isolating work, and I did it because the alternative was sitting still with my grief and my anger, and movement was the only thing keeping either of them from swallowing me whole. I slept poorly those first nights, the propane heater ticking in the dark, rain finding its way through the gaps in the roof in a slow, persistent drip that I eventually learned to position my sleeping bag around. I ate cold food from cans because I didn't trust myself to manage a camp stove safely inside a structure the county had condemned for fire risk, and I showered, when I showered at all, at a truck stop 11 miles down the highway that charged $8 for hot water and a clean towel. I told myself during those first 3 days that this was temporary, that I would clear enough salvageable wood to sell, scrape together a deposit, and be back in an actual apartment within a month. I did not yet understand that the work itself was doing something for me beyond the practical. Every board I pried loose, every section of rusted hardware I cleared away, was a small, physical act of reclaiming something, even if I couldn't have articulated what. Exactly. I thought I was reclaiming. My hands blistered and then calloused. My shoulders ached with a deep, unfamiliar fatigue that was, in its own way, easier to carry than the alternative ache that lived behind my ribs whenever I let myself stop moving long enough to think about my father. On the 4th day, a storm rolled in off the coast, the kind of violent Pacific system that turns an afternoon to near darkness and drives rain sideways against anything standing. I was working to move a heavy cast-iron stove that had been sitting half-buried in the dirt floor near the center of the barn, wedging a crowbar beneath its base and throwing my weight against it, when the bar punched through the dirt entirely and sank nearly 2 feet before striking something solid with a sound that was unmistakably metal. I sat back hard, breathing fast, staring at the hole. The ground there wasn't simply packed earth. Something was hollow beneath it. I found an old shovel among the debris and started digging, and the dirt came away loose and uneven, not the compacted texture of undisturbed ground, but the looser fill of something that had been deliberately placed. 10 minutes of digging in the pouring rain revealed a flat, poured concrete surface, roughly where the stove had stood, and at its center, a recessed iron trapdoor, rust-flaked and heavy, secured by an industrial brass padlock thick enough that I knew immediately it had not been installed for any ordinary purpose. I knelt there in the rain and the mud and thought about the stories my father used to tell, the ones the rest of the family treated as colourful exaggeration that his grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, had not built the family's original fortune in any conventional way, that there had been talk, generations back, of Prohibition-era rum running along the Oregon coast, of a fortune that the official family history said had been lost entirely in the 1929 crash. I had always assumed it was the kind of romantic embellishment families add to otherwise ordinary histories. I ran back to my car through the rain and got the bolt cutters I'd bought for fence wire, and I came back and fitted them over the shackle of the padlock and threw my full weight onto the handles until, with a sharp metallic crack, the rusted lock gave way. The trapdoor itself was heavier than I expected, hinges shrieking in protest as I hauled it open, and a rush of cold, stale air came up from below, carrying the unmistakable smell of old paper and machine oil, and something colder underneath that I would later understand was simply the smell of a sealed space that had not exchanged air with the world in decades. My flashlight beam found a narrow set of poured concrete steps descending straight down into the dark. I went down. At the bottom of the stairs, my light found a wall of riveted steel, a vault door, the genuine industrial article, complete with a multi-spoked wheel and a brass combination dial, the kind of thing you'd expect bolted into a 1930s bank, rather than buried beneath a condemned barn. My stomach dropped. A combination lock with no combination was, functionally, the end of the search. But as I moved the light across the concrete frame around the door, I caught a faint set of marks scratched into the surface, low near the base, the kind of thing you would only notice if you were looking directly at that section in the right light. A sequence of numbers, scored by hand, decades old by the look of the weathering around them, 0, 3, 1, 4, 6, 1. I stared at it for a long moment before the recognition hit me. It was my mother's birthday, the 14th of March, 1961. My hands were shaking too hard to manage the dial cleanly on the first attempt. I forced myself to slow down, to breathe, and tried again. Left to 0, 3, right to 14, left to 61. And when I pulled the heavy wheel toward me, it gave with a deep mechanical groan and a series of bolts retracting somewhere inside the door's thickness. The vault swung open. I found a pull string attached to an old porcelain fixture just inside, and when I tugged it, a row of bare bulbs flickered on along the ceiling, washing the room in warm amber light. I stopped breathing for a moment. The room was large, fully finished in reinforced concrete, dry and climate-stable, in a way that made no sense for an unpowered structure, until I noticed, much later, the discrete ventilation system built into the wall, still running on what I would eventually learn was a buried solar array my father had quietly installed 2 years earlier. Along one wall, stacked in neat rows, were wooden crates stamped in faded ink, property of Pacific Distillers Limited, 1924. I pried the lid off the nearest one with the edge of my crowbar and found, packed in straw, dozens of sealed bottles of Prohibition-era whiskey, untouched, the kind of find that collectors would pay extraordinary sums for sight unseen. But the whiskey was the smallest part of it. In the center of the room stood 3 large industrial safes, their doors already unlatched. I opened the first and found canvas sacks, and when I untied the nearest and tipped it, gold bars spilled across the concrete floor with a sound like nothing I had ever heard, dozens of them, alongside hundreds of gold coins from the 1920s, mint clear and gleaming under the bulbs. The second safe held stacks of vintage gold certificates, sealed in modern vacuum bags, that told me clearly someone had been down here recently, organizing, protecting, preparing. On a shelf in the third safe sat a plain steel lockbox, and resting on top of it, an envelope with my name written across the front in my father's unmistakable, slightly shaking handwriting. I tore it open with hands that would not stay still. "My dearest Hailey," the letter began, dated just over 2 years earlier, written, I understood from the date, not long after his diagnosis, but before Margaret had fully closed the doors between us. If you are reading this, it means the disease finally took enough of me that Margaret saw her opening, and that she took it the way I always suspected she eventually would. I am so sorry I could not protect you from what was coming while I still had the clarity to fight for you directly. I had to fight a different way instead, and I need you to understand why. When the diagnosis came, I did what any frightened man would do. I started paying closer attention to everything around me, because I no longer trusted my own mind to catch what it used to catch automatically. What I found, when I finally looked carefully, was that Margaret had been systematically moving money out of the company for nearly 2 years before I ever got sick. Small amounts at first, routed through vendor accounts that didn't quite check out, then larger amounts funneled into offshore structures registered under Connor's name. She believed I was too distracted, and later too compromised, to notice. She was wrong on both counts, though I let her believe otherwise, because the moment she understood I knew, she would have moved to have me declared incompetent and removed from any position to stop her. I could not divorce her without triggering a legal battle that would have tied the estate up in litigation for years and left you with nothing while the lawyers consumed what remained. So I built something else instead. Over the better part of 3 years, using business trips and hunting weekends as cover, I quietly liquidated the genuine family fortune, the one your great-great-grandfather actually built, the one the family story has always claimed was lost in 1929, and was, in fact, simply hidden by him and then by every generation since who knew the truth and kept it. I moved what I could of our liquid wealth into the form you have just found, and I brought it here, to the one piece of property Margaret would never bother to investigate, because she has never in her life valued anything she could not display. I drafted my will to give her precisely what she wanted: the mansion, the company, the visible wealth. What she does not know, and will not know until it is too late to undo, is that the company is carrying nearly $30 million in leveraged debt that I allowed to accumulate deliberately in the final years, structured in a way my lawyers and accountants can explain to federal investigators in considerable detail. The money she stole constitutes wire fraud on a scale that will not be difficult to prove once the right people start looking. She believes she has inherited an empire. She has, in fact, inherited a controlled demolition, and I have made certain the detonator is already in place. Inside the lockbox is a flash drive containing every piece of evidence my investigators compiled: bank records, IP addresses, signatures, the full architecture of what she built. Use it. The gold and the whiskey and the cash in this room are entirely separate from the estate, secured under a private trust your great-grandfather established decades ago that was never part of any will and is legally, unambiguously yours under the Miller Tract deed. Take what is here. Take the company down. Take our name back. I am sorry I couldn't be the one standing beside you when this happens, but I made certain you would never have to face her without a weapon equal to what she used against us. I love you more than I ever found the words to say while I still had all of mine. Never let her see you bleed. Dad. I sat on the concrete floor of that vault for a long time after I finished reading, the letter pressed against my chest, the rain still hammering the world above me. The grief I had been carrying since the funeral did not disappear, but it changed shape. It stopped being only a weight and became, underneath the weight, something with an edge to it, something I could finally use. My father had not abandoned me to a worthless barn. He had handed me, with extraordinary patience and precision, the only weapon that could actually reach Margaret where she lived. I drove to Thomas Whitfield's office the next morning, still in the same mud-streaked clothes I'd been wearing in the vault, bypassing the receptionist entirely. Whitfield looked up from his desk with an expression that shifted rapidly from alarm to something closer to disbelief as I set a canvas bag on his desk heavy enough to make the wood creak, and unzipped it to reveal 3 gold bars catching the office light. "Call the FBI, Tom," I said, "and get me the best forensic accountant in this city. We're going to need both." It took 6 weeks to build the case properly. Whitfield connected me with a federal financial crimes attorney named Renata Cole, a precise, unflappable woman who reviewed the flash drive's contents over the course of 2 days and told me, at the end of it, that she had rarely seen embezzlement documentation this clean. My father, even with his mind failing him in other ways, had apparently never lost his instinct for thorough paperwork. The forensic accountant she brought in traced the offshore accounts within days, confirming exactly what my father's letter had described. Nearly $8 million moved through shell structures, registered to Connor, alongside a debt position in the company that was, if anything, worse than my father had estimated. The FBI moved with the kind of quiet, methodical patience that television never quite captures, building the case over weeks while Margaret, entirely unaware that anything was wrong, planned what the Portland Society pages would later describe as the social event of the season. She held the gala at the Lake Oswego mansion 6 weeks after the funeral, a $10,000 a plate benefit, ostensibly for a local arts foundation, in reality a coronation. I learned later, from people who attended, that she spent the evening drifting between clusters of Portland's wealthiest residents in a custom gown, accepting compliments on how beautifully she had revived what she called a house that had been gathering dust under Raymond's old-fashioned habits. I arrived a little after 9, in a car Renata Cole had arranged, wearing my mother's diamond pendant, the one piece of real heirloom jewelry Margaret had spent weeks searching for after the funeral and never found, because my father had given it to me years earlier and I had simply never told her. Beside me were 2 federal agents in plain dark jackets and Thomas Whitfield, who had insisted, despite my objections, on being present for what came next. The string quartet faltered as we crossed the gravel toward the entrance. Margaret's head of security moved to intercept us, and one of the agents simply lifted a badge, and the man stopped as though he'd hit a wall. Margaret crossed the lawn toward us with the controlled fury of a woman who believed, even then, that this was a problem of etiquette rather than a problem of consequence. "Hailey," she said, "this is a private event. You are not welcome here." "We're not here for the party," I said. The lead agent stepped forward and identified himself, and I watched something in Margaret's face begin, very slowly, to come apart. Connor pushed through the gathering crowd, his composure already fraying. "What is this?" he demanded. "What's going on?" "Federal wire fraud," I said, looking at Margaret. "Embezzlement, falsified corporate filings. Did you really think he didn't see you, Margaret? Did you think the dementia made him blind instead of just quiet?" "This is insane," Margaret said, though sweat had begun to show at her hairline despite the cool evening air. "The will is ironclad." 3 doctors certified his competency. "The will is completely valid," I agreed. "You own everything it gave you, the mansion, the company. Congratulations, that makes you and Connor the legally responsible officers for $30 million in debt the company is currently carrying, debt the IRS and your creditors are about to take a very close look at. You inherited exactly what he left you, Margaret. You just never asked what that actually was." "The accounts," Margaret said, her voice losing its polish entirely now, climbing toward panic. "The capital was never part of the estate," I said. "It belonged to a trust that predates either of us. I found it, under the barn. The one you told me to enjoy the mud in." I watched the realization hit her in stages, first confusion, then the dawning, horrified understanding of exactly what she had handed away without knowing it, and what she had, in exchange, walked directly into. She raised her hand toward me, more reflex than plan, and one of the agents caught her wrist before it completed the motion. "Margaret Whitmore, you're under arrest," he said, and the rest of the words were the ones you've heard before, delivered evenly over the sound of a string quartet trying, unsuccessfully, to keep playing through what was happening on the lawn in front of them. Connor made it almost to the garden gate before 2 more agents brought him down into the rose bushes. Around us, Portland's wealthiest residents scattered toward the valley stand in a controlled stampede of evening wear, already reaching for their phones. I stood very still and watched the handcuffs close around Margaret's wrists, watched her mascara begin to run in the same rhythmic, performed pattern I remembered from the funeral. Except this time the tears, I think, were finally real. Margaret was sentenced 14 months later to 12 years in federal prison on charges that included wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Connor received a shorter sentence on lesser charges, his attorneys successfully arguing a reduced role, though the offshore accounts that bore his signature made the argument considerably harder than he'd hoped. The mansion was foreclosed on within 4 months of the gala, once the company's true debt position became public. The auto parts chain was liquidated in pieces over the following year, sold off to competitors at a fraction of what it had once been worth. I did not buy the mansion back. I considered it, briefly, in the disorienting weeks after the arrests, when the scale of what I had inherited still felt like something that belonged to someone else's life. But the mansion had been my father's life with Margaret in it. 3 years of a version of him I had been locked out of, and I had no interest in living inside that particular memory. Connor reached out to me once, about 8 months after the gala, in the brief window between his sentencing and the start of his prison term. He called from a number I didn't recognize and asked, in a voice that had lost all the entitled boredom I remembered from the funeral, whether there was anything I could do to help reduce what he was facing, some testimony, some leniency, some acknowledgement that he had been less culpable than his mother. I told him, honestly, that I had no influence over federal sentencing and wouldn't have used it in his favor even if I did, because the offshore accounts had carried his signature and his name, and whatever role his mother had played in shaping his choices, the choices had still, in the end, been his to make or refuse. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he apologized, not elaborately, not in a way that asked for anything in return, just a short, flat acknowledgement that he understood now what his mother had built and what it had cost. I did not forgive him in any meaningful sense, but I did not feel the need to hate him either. He struck me, by the end of that call, as someone who had simply never been taught to ask the questions that might have stopped any of it, and that felt like its own kind of quiet tragedy, separate from what had happened to my father. I rebuilt the Miller tract instead. The barn's structurally sound reclaimed timber became the bones of a new house, modern and quiet, built on the same 2 acres where I had once camped in a tent with a propane heater and nowhere else to go. I hired a local architect who specialized in working with reclaimed materials, a woman named Priya Nair who walked the property with me in the first weeks after the case concluded and talked about the barn's bones with a reverence. I appreciated the hand-hewn beams, the wide plank flooring that had somehow survived decades of neglect intact beneath the rot. We designed the house to honor what had been there before rather than erase it, and I found, in the months of construction that followed, a steadiness I hadn't expected. There is something genuinely restorative about watching a place be built carefully, board by board, after spending so long watching things in your life come apart instead. The vault is still there, sealed beneath what is now my living room floor, though most of what it held has long since been catalogued, appraised, and converted the whiskey to private collectors, the gold and coins into the kind of diversified, legitimate holdings my father would have approved of, careful and unglamorous, and built to last rather than to impress anyone at a gala. I kept the combination dial, though. I had it removed from the original vault door and mounted, framed, on the wall of my study. The numbers of my mother's birthday still scratched faintly into the metal beside it. It seemed wrong to discard the one thing that had actually opened the door. My name is Hailey Preston. I am 24 years old, and I buried my father in the rain in a year that took almost everything I had left, and I was handed a condemned barn as what I was meant to understand as an insult, the smallest, most worthless thing anyone could think to give me. It was the only thing that was ever real. Everything else, the mansion, the company, the version of my father's life that Margaret built around herself for 3 years, was a performance staged for an audience that never bothered to look underneath it. My father knew that. He spent the last years of his failing mind making sure that when the performance finally collapsed, I would be the one left standing in the wreckage with everything that actually mattered already safely in my hands. I sit on my porch most evenings now, looking out over land that used to be nothing but brambles and a leaning, condemned barn, and I think about how easily I could have refused to go out there at all. I think about how close I came to simply giving up, the day Margaret slid that waiver across the table, and I signed it with a hand that did not yet know what it was actually agreeing to keep. They tried to bury me with nothing. They didn't account for what was already buried, waiting underneath.